Picture the scene. You're stood on a damp floodplain, stretching miles into the distance. Below your feet, shallow puddles of water have spilled out onto the flat, low-lying river basin, which surrounds the immediate area. Thick, boggy marshland is abundant. Straight ahead, a slow-moving river snakes through the land, producing the muddy wetlands that characterize the landscape. The river lies in the shadow of distant peaks that emerge over the horizon, piercing the clouds that fill the gray, overcast sky of the Early Cretaceous of Niger, Africa. Several meters behind you lie sparsely forested open woodlands, from which the chirping of insects can be heard, as well as the odd pterosaur. A small lizard scurries onto a rock a few feet away, and, noticing your presence, immediately shifts off in the opposite direction to find a clearer spot to relax. A large herd of Lurdusaurus, a genus of heavy-built, long-necked iguanodont, has now emerged from the trees to drink from the reliable water supply that dominates the landscape. The gruff, mumbling calls of the herbivores, now abruptly overpowering the soundscape. Between the dinosaurs and the commotion kicked up in the marshland between them, you notice an individual that doesn't look quite right. Shorter at the shoulder, broader, and with the majority of its length composed of its neck and tail. It's plainly a sauropod, completely unrelated to Lurdusaurus, but it's roughly the same size as them, at around 9 meters in length. This is abnormally small for a sauropod. The group of long-necked, often giant dinosaurs, which included creatures such as Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus. Even so, it's still very big when it's standing this close to you. The strange creature rears its head to check that the coast is clear of predators, and snorts a brief grunt of satisfaction from its nose and mouth, particles of sand gracing the humid afternoon air as it does so. Lowering its thick, extended neck to the water, it takes a long, deep drink. This is Nigersaurus, one of the most amazing dinosaur discoveries of the entire African continent. Nigersaurus, meaning Niger lizard, or rather lizard from Niger, is a species of relatively small REBBACHISAURID sauropod dinosaur, which was discovered in 1976, but wasn't officially named until 1999. Eventually, in 1999, it was given the species name Nigersaurus taqueti, after its discoverer, French paleontologist Philippe Taquet, who only actually discovered a few bones at the time. Thankfully, now we have a much better understanding of what this creature looked like. Despite the fact that this dinosaur was discovered over 40 years ago, paleontologists didn't really get a good understanding of what the creature may have looked like in life until the end of the 2000s. Very recently, in terms of scientific understanding, this was due largely to the lack of fossils discovered from the creature that were in good enough condition to reliably study. When well-preserved specimens did begin to show up, it was possible for scientists to discern just what it was they had found and why it was so special. Moreover, Nigersaurus is now the second most abundant herbivore of the area and time, second only to the aforementioned Lurdusaurus. The dinosaur was named and described by paleontologist Paul Sereno, who subsequently spent a lot of time in the field, excavating and studying the prehistoric creatures of the ELRHAZ formation of Niger, Africa, where Nigersaurus was discovered. Sereno is credited with discovering almost complete fossil specimens of Nigersaurus, which have aided immensely in allowing paleontologists and paleoartists to get a better understanding of what this creature may have looked like and how it lived, allowing for very accurate reconstructions of the animal. As it stands, at the time this video is being recorded, we are just missing a few bones from the animal. just a few from the ribs and vertebrae. Perhaps these will show up in future excavations of the region, allowing us to complete the fossils of this marvelous creature. Paul Sereno even kept an amazing field journal of his discoveries. Discoveries that would prove to not only Paul, but the wider paleontology community to be very, very fruitful indeed. An excerpt from his journal reads, September 9th, 2000. Our first week in the field has been spectacular. Remarkable discoveries seem to be waiting for us around every dune. On our first day, we found bones of the long-necked dinosaur Nigersaurus. Nigersaurus, you might remember, we named for bones collected on the last expedition here 3 years ago. This sauropod, long-necked dinosaur, has an unusual skull, containing as many as 500 slender teeth. A major goal of this expedition is to find the rest of this unusual dinosaur, so we can describe it and reconstruct it for everyone to see. Sereno was justly rewarded with his study, as he continued. We are closing in on that goal fast, because we came upon a skeleton a few days later. This skeleton is lying on its side, with the tail curved upward. The curve of the backbone measures about 15 feet. We carefully brushed the sand off the 110 million-year-old bones and dug channels between the major areas of the skeleton. Soon we will cover each area in plaster so that the skeleton can be transported out of the field and back to the laboratory. Sereno's work has provided us with much that we know about this creature, which would prove to be much stranger than what initially met the eye. Nigersaurus was not built like your average sauropod. Proportionally, the animal had a much shorter neck than that of its cousins, but it was still long enough to obviously distinguish it as a sauropod. It stood at just over 2 meters tall and 9 meters long, which, again, separated it from many of its colossal relatives, some of which were capable of reaching over 20 gargantuan meters in length, similar in size to the mighty blue whale, the largest animal that has ever lived. The 4-ton dinosaur walked with its neck and tail held horizontally at each end of the body. Instead of raising it high up like Brachiosaurus, each end providing an effective counterbalance for the other. The strangest feature of Nigersaurus, however, can be found within its jaws, specifically its teeth, all 500 of them. You heard that right, 500. After its discovery in 2007, Paul Sereno proclaimed it as one of the weirdest dinosaurs he had ever seen, comparing its mouth to a vacuum cleaner. Nigersaurus's teeth were tiny, packed tightly together within a wide, flat mouth that was indeed very much like the end of a vacuum cleaner. The teeth were in fact stacked vertically, above and below each other, within the top and bottom jaws respectively. The dinosaur is believed to have had, at any one time, 60 teeth on its top jaw and 68 teeth on the bottom. These teeth were expected to last around 2 weeks before falling out, meaning that Nigersaurus constantly needed a fresh supply. Enter the additional layers. As soon as a tooth was ejected from the mouth, a fresh one would shortly emerge to take its place from the other layers, ensuring that the dinosaur was able to constantly, effectively scrape ground-level plant matter from the plentiful vegetation that would have filled the forests and marshlands of Niger around 120 million years ago. It is Nigersaurus's habit of feasting on ground-level vegetation that has seen scientists dub it with the nickname, the Mesozoic cow. Much like a modern-day bovine, Nigersaurus would have used its wide, flat snout and the tiny scraping teeth within to shred plant matter from the branches of the plants closest to the ground, perhaps the ones that were growing around the waterline of the floodplain it inhabited. The dinosaur's bizarre dental arrangements have also seen it break a pretty obscure record. Its teeth are positioned further forward in its skull than any other tetrapod that has ever lived. These teeth are also unique among sauropod dinosaurs. Surprisingly, no other sauropod dinosaur has yet been unearthed with such strange battery-like tooth reserves. Due to the positioning of the mouth and the structure of the skull, it was unlikely that this dinosaur would have been able to open its mouth very wide at all, only able to open its jaws wide enough to fit in the necessary plant matter and water, sucking the nutrients up towards its lengthy digestive system. We mentioned before that Nigersaurus adopted a horizontal stance, but this may or may not be entirely accurate. There is much scientific debate surrounding the exact stance this dinosaur preferred to habitually adopt, much of this stemming from the animal's neck vertebrae. The original argument stated that Nigersaurus kept its neck held at a 67-degree downward angle so it could easily feed on low-growing shrubbery and vegetation, but analysis of the neck bones have raised the idea that the neck may have been much more flexible than we first imagined. The jury is still out on this one, but many popular depictions of Nigersaurus tend to favor the former stance as gospel, showing a creature that held its head low as it slowly ambled through the early Cretaceous floodplains of Niger. Another notable bizarre feature of Nigersaurus is the nature of its skull. As well as being the only fossil discovered so far, which features jawbones wider than the actual skull itself, the skull in its entirety was very lightweight and delicate. Only a single centimeter of bone connected the animal's muscle to the back of its skull, and this bone was only around 2 millimeters thick. Some of these bones were so thin they were almost transparent, allowing sunlight to pass straight through them. This gives us some insight as to why it took paleontologists so long to discover reliable specimens of the dinosaur. If the bones were this lightweight, thin and delicate, it's no wonder they were so difficult for scientists to unearth without completely destroying them in the process. Judging by studies performed on the cranial bones of Nigersaurus, it can even be determined that this dinosaur was probably of average intelligence, possessing a brain-to-body mass ratio which was completely average for a reptile. The theropods and ornithischians it shared the floodplains and forests with were likely slightly more intelligent. But the cerebrum of the dinosaur makes up about 30% of the entire brain, indicating that the creature was neither fool or a genius. The eye sockets of Nigersaurus's skull were also proportionally much larger than the average sauropod dinosaur. And a good theory as to why this might have been loops us back around to the argument about the dinosaur's stance and feeding habits. If Nigersaurus did spend the majority of its time with its head held low, grazing from the low-growing vegetation, like a large reptilian cow, it needed to be cautious. It shared the area with numerous large theropod dinosaurs, more on them later, and it needed to be able to see them coming. To compensate for the time spent with its head held down low, it has been theorized that Nigersaurus may have had excellent eyesight, able to view approaching danger from a wide radius as it was feeding at ground level. It is also well worth paying attention to the dinosaur's nose, or rather, what evolution bothered keeping of it. Perhaps due to its good eyesight and reliance on its vision, the dinosaur's sense of smell had diminished greatly, as was revealed upon completing a study of the creature's brain cavity. It retained the deep, long nostrils of many sauropod species, but the olfactory lobes, the features of the nasal area that determine how well an animal can smell, were greatly diminished. Serino also made a point of discussing observations in Nigersaurus's peculiar spine, touring the skeleton, and explaining it in an article with NPR in 2007. He said, "The animal is about 30 feet long, and we are standing at the base of the neck that rises above our heads. And when you see the vertebrae in front of us, there's more air in each one of these vertebrae, in the neck and in the back, than there is bone. Many sauropods, such as Nigersaurus, would have had their bodies lined with air sacs in order to keep themselves more lightweight, reducing the pressures of their massive frames. Nigersaurus was no different, representing an animal that, for its size, was almost outlandishly lightweight. Finally, we come to the dinosaur's tail. This structure was extremely long in some sauropods, and Nigersaurus was the proud owner of a formidable weapon at the end of its tail. When threatened with attack from one of the region's large carnivorous theropod dinosaurs, Nigersaurus, very similar to Diplodocus, would have been able to swing and crack its tail like a whip, wounding or off-putting its assailant. It surely would have been an intimidating sight to see herds of Nigersaurus defending themselves from attack, swinging their tails in elaborate intimidation displays to make themselves look larger or more threatening. Nigersaurus fossils have been dug up in what is now the ELRHAZ Formation, a strata of rocks in the Tenere Desert of modern Niger. Although the area today is hot and barren, millions of years ago, when Nigersaurus roamed the earth, a vast river ran through the area, creating the aforementioned floodplain. The specimens of Nigersaurus that scientists have unearthed from the region likely died and fell into this river, or were dragged into it by the floodwater. There, they would have been covered up in layers of sediment and preserved, frozen in time, for humans to come and dig up in the present day. It's not just Nigersaurus that has been unearthed at this site, however. As well as being famous for its dinosaur stock, the ELRHAZ is well known for its strange species of crocodilian, some of which were very different to the ones you and I recognize today. As Nigersaurus drank from the river, it needed to be wary, especially in the earlier stages of its life, of a creature named Sarcosuchus. Sarcosuchus, whose name literally translates to English as flesh crocodile, was a giant. At 9.5 meters in length, it would have readily taken on many of the ELRHAZ dinosaurs, and even adult Nigersaurus were fair game for the giant croc. It resembled a gigantic version of today's modern gharials, with a long, winding paddle-like tail and thin, elongated snout. Like modern crocs, it would have laid in wait just below the surface of the water, waiting for an unwary Nigersaurus to appear, before launching itself at the helpless victim. Not all of the ELRHAZ crocodilians were quite this monstrous, though. Some of them were just downright bizarre, sharing the waterways and riverbanks that sustained our Nigersaurus were the meter-long Arica and the even smaller Anatosuchus. These were agile crocodilians that walked on elongated, stilt-like limbs, either running after prey or stalking it at the water's edge like a heron. The latter, Anatosuchus, gets its name from the outlandish, flat, duck-like snout it possessed, which will have greatly aided it in its strange feeding methods. It's the dinosaurs that make up the majority of the major ELRHAZ finds, however, and Nigersaurus had some stiff competition. Aside from Lurdusaurus, the aforementioned iguanodont, the famous Oranosaurus was present in the area, a peculiar basal hadrosaur with a sail running down along its back and tail. Nigersaurus represents the only known sauropod stock, but at the same size as a few of its contemporaries, it would have likely provided an easy meal for some of the region's top predators. Potentially the region's top predator was a theropod dinosaur known as Cryptops, a large abelosaurid theropod roughly 7 meters from nose to tail. With tiny arms, long legs, and powerful jaws, Cryptops superficially resembled famous predatory dinosaurs such as Carnotaurus or Majungasaurus, and would have been almost as deadly capable of bringing down a Nigersaurus on its own, although it could have hunted in small groups or pairs. Eocarcharia is another large carnivore, more than capable of bringing down a Nigersaurus, this time a basal carcharodontosaurid rather than an abelosaurid. At pretty much the same length as Cryptops, this dinosaur was more slenderly built, with much longer arms. It certainly wasn't an easy place for a young Nigersaurus to grow up. The most famous dinosaur the ELRHAZ formation has offered up yet is without a doubt Suchomimus, the strange crocodile-like spinosaurid dinosaur that would have waded by the water's edge, snapping up large fish in its long jaws. At 10 meters long, Suchomimus was the region's largest theropod, and while it most likely preyed primarily on fish, it is not out of the question that this creature might have turned to hunting, or at least scavenging, from large dinosaurs, such as Nigersaurus, when the river's stocks weren't providing. The fish preyed upon by Suchomimus may well have included the likes of Mawsonia, however, a gigantic relative of the coelacanth that was well suited to a freshwater existence, thriving in numbers in the waterways of the ELRHAZ, a fish that was also on the menu elsewhere in North Africa for Spinosaurus. Remains of multiple other species have also been unearthed by scientists at the ELRHAZ formation. A species of pterosaur, which would have flown high above the dramatic scenes below, would have snatched fish from the river that ran through the ELRHAZ formation, perhaps breeding in large numbers on higher ground. Several species of turtle have been discovered, which would have lived in the shadow of the large dinosaurs as they came down to the water to drink. Most surprisingly, a species of hybodont, a Mesozoic shark, has also been discovered in the region. This shark would have prowled the riverine waterways, perhaps like a modern-day bull shark occasionally does. Freshwater bivalves would have provided a key food source for many different creatures, which would have lived in abundance at the bottom of the river. As for the flora of the ELRHAZ formation, the land was dominated by ferns, horsetails, and angiosperms, which were among the most common species of plant at the time. Grass did not evolve until the late Cretaceous, millions of years after Nigersaurus had gone extinct, meaning that these low-growing plant species would have been the food sources that this dinosaur was highly specialized in eating. In the surrounding forests, other species could be found. Conifers and cycads composed the bulk of the wooded areas, towering above Nigersaurus and providing food for the area's taller, more adaptable creatures, such as Lurdusaurus or Tyrannosaurus. Aquatic vegetation was also abundant, which would have been an important food source for many river dwellers. Due to the length of Nigersaurus's neck, it would likely have been unable to reach down and grab the vegetation growing at the bottom of the river, remaining earthbound on the side of the bank. Within the wider sauropod group was the family REBBACHISAURIDS, which contained Nigersaurus and its closest known relatives. The family contains 11 known species, the most famous of which is Nigersaurus. Characterized by their stocky, bulky bodies and elongated tails, these sauropods can be found all over the western half of the world, from Argentina to Spain and Niger. Dinosaurs from this family were extant throughout the Cretaceous period, from its early to middle stages, and would likely have shared similar lifestyles. There are even dubious, unconfirmed specimens of potential REBBACHISAURS from India, meaning that this may have been a very widespread family. REBBACHISAURUS, the creature from which the family takes its name, was the first to be identified and placed within the grouping in 1990 by sauropod paleontologist Jack McIntosh. Prior to his classification, the dinosaur was assumed to be a diplodocid, directly related to the iconic Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, and Brontosaurus It is now understood that the REBBACHISAURIDS, which were later broadened to include Nigersaurus, were instead diplodocomorphs, related to, but not directly, dinosaurs such as Diplodocus. Dinosaur taxonomy can often be a minefield of reshuffling, disagreements, and complications, and scientists are continuously updating and rethinking which dinosaurs should be placed where and for what reason. José Bonaparte, the esteemed Argentine paleontologist that is credited with discovering many famous South American dinosaurs, such as Carnotaurus, Riojasaurus, and Saltosaurus, later officially described the family in 1997, and REBBACHISAURIDAe has been filled with the likes of Zapalosaurus, Limisaurus, and Amazonsaurus since, as well as Nigersaurus's closest relatives, Demandasaurus and Tatuinia. REBBACHISAURIDs can be distinguished from diplodocids by their lack of divided neural spine bones, and have much more distinctive teeth than the latter, like the ones found in Nigersaurus. In his 2000 expedition to the ELRHAZ formation in Niger, Paul Sereno also stumbled across hatchling Nigersauruses, otherwise affectionately known as sauropodlids. Lying on a wide, flat area of purple-tinted sandstone was a tiny fossil which clearly resembled a baby sauropod, with Nigersaurus being the only sauropod native to the immediate vicinity. It made sense that this was, without a doubt, a Nigersaurus hatchling. The fossil was a section of skull from the baby dinosaur's upper jaw, and Sereno commented in his journal that the bone was no bigger than a silver dollar. He determined that the sauropodlid was unfortunately less than 1 year old when it died. Perhaps it fell into the river, or was chased into it by a predator, where it was capable of becoming fossilized and preserved for millions of years. We can speculate on how a baby Nigersaurus might have lived the early years of its life. Many sauropod species, especially the diplodocids, gave birth to comparatively tiny hatchlings, laying their eggs in nests, which were hidden deep within the wooded regions of the area they inhabited. Sauropod hatchlings were so tiny, as the dinosaurs were lumbered with the physical limitations of carrying and laying an egg. Since the eggs were small, the dinosaurs inside needed to be too. Gregory Erickson, paleontologist at the Florida State University, has extensively studied sauropod growth, determining that some of these creatures may have grown by as much as 14 kilograms a day, feeding on low-lying plant matter in the wooded regions of their respective localities. Pregnant female sauropods, when ready to lay their eggs, would congregate in the forests, digging up sections of the forest floor with their forelimbs in order to create a ditch-like nest to lay their clutches. When the dinosaurs hatched, they would be tiny and vulnerable, so the forest was the best place for them to spend their time, instead of out in the open with the large theropods and no obvious hiding place to get away from them. The baby dinosaurs would have lived their early stages of life out in the woods away from the parents, relatively safe from harm, barring the smaller predators of the forests, forming creches of hatchling to juvenile age animals to provide safety in numbers. We can speculate that Nigersaurus babies might have been doing the same thing in the woodlands of Cretaceous Africa, banding together to keep themselves from harm. When the dinosaurs grew big enough, they would either form or join herds out on the floodplains with other adults, where suitable food was more plentiful. Larger predators, such as cryptops, would have been hunting out on the floodplains. But with their bulkier adult bodies and herds of adults, the subadult Nigersauruses would have been just as safe. Extinction took place within the dinosaurs for a variety of reasons, some of which the general public don't typically associate with dinosaurs, and scientists believe they have found Nigersauruses. We know from its skull and spine that Nigersaurus was adapted to feeding on the low-growing vegetation of the ELRHAZ riverbanks and forests. This dinosaur was, as a result, very specialized for a sauropod, as it would not have been able to reach the higher-growing vegetation enjoyed by taller dinosaurs such as Lurdusaurus. The theory is as follows. As the Cretaceous period progressed, the low-growing vegetation that Nigersaurus was entirely dependent upon began to grow more and more sparsely, meaning that it was more difficult for the dinosaur to find enough food to sustain an entire species. Perhaps new creatures evolved that were able to feed on this particular food source more effectively, resulting in more and more Nigersauruses going hungry as the millennia came and went. Eventually, Nigersaurus would have become critically endangered as a result of its dwindling food supply, and as a result of it not being able to reach or consume the higher vegetation of the region. The last few Nigersauruses unfortunately died out, giving way to more successful lineages of the other species sharing the region with it. For the many species of dinosaur that did not go extinct as a result of mass extinction, this would have been a similar fate awaiting them. Think of the modern animals that are predicted to go extinct as a result of climate change. Species of quoll, an Australian marsupial, are facing extinction due to the introduction of less specialized invasive species, resulting in them losing their food supplies. Koalas are also vulnerable, as they feed almost exclusively on eucalyptus leaves, which, once in decline, the little arboreal mammals will struggle to sustain themselves on. Life's greatest survivors have always been the generalist, animals that are able to adapt to any situation or circumstance, resistant creatures that can eat many different types of food. Modern creatures that will no doubt prove successful over the Nigersauruses of the modern day are the crows, rats, cockroaches, and raccoons. Creatures that can adapt and survive to many different scenarios. It's hard to imagine a colossal Brachiosaurus-sized sauropod amongst the wildlife of modern-day Niger. But for something a bit more in line with Nigersaurus, it's not that much of a stretch. When fully grown, Nigersaurus was roughly the same size as a modern-day African elephant, an animal that does indeed inhabit the grasslands and open plains of Niger today. Modern Niger is home to many large megafaunal animals, such as the hippopotamus, West African giraffe, and African buffalo. Perhaps the buffalo is more in line with a modern analog of Nigersaurus, as Nigersaurus was not the biggest herbivore of its time and locality. That honor goes to Lurdusaurus. We can imagine herds of Nigersaurus mixing with and feeding amongst larger herds of Lurdusaurus, perhaps sticking by the larger animals for safety, or to track reliable sources of food and water. After all, Nigersaurus is colloquially referred to as the Mesozoic cow as a result of its grazing behavior. Nigersaurus is a fantastic example that there is more than meets the eye to many different species of dinosaur. At first sight, Nigersaurus is a very nondescript sauropod, often depicted in dull shades of brown and beige. It's not a dinosaur that would draw particular attention to members of the public if they didn't know about the bizarre structural differences and inner workings of this enigma of a dinosaur, which we will no doubt continue to learn about as the years progress. Africa, in particular, has been a hotbed of strange discoveries that have paved the way in modern paleontology. Just look at the likes of Spinosaurus, for example. What else might there be waiting to be discovered about creatures such as Nigersaurus? How little do we know about its fellow REBBACHISAURID relatives that may be of even more extreme interest than this. The answers are, without a doubt, out there, buried beneath the captivating Cretaceous rocks of Africa. Nigersaurus is an amazing example of the sheer diversity of life exhibited in not only dinosaurs as a whole, but the sauropods alone. The classic images of sauropods depict a slow, lumbering, long-necked creature. But Nigersaurus defies that myth. With its short neck, small stature, unique feeding method, and strange skull, Nigersaurus truly is one of the strangest dinosaur discoveries paleontologists have made to date.